So this talk has the pleasant task of persuading you that there are more big open questions in literary history than we may think, because we probably know less than we think about large-scale historical patterns. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Good. It's a pleasant task because, if I'm right, it means we have exciting research opportunities. But persuading you should also be difficult because it seems unlikely that we would have missed large patterns in literary history. The normal way to think about the progress of knowledge is that we start by getting the large outlines roughly right, and then proceed to fill in details. That's often how our curricula are organized. And by now, frankly, we've had a long time to get the outlines right. We've done a lot of fine-tuning, recognizing the exclusions based on gender, class, or race has already led us to expand the list of works we write about several times. And although Franco Moretti points out that we still can't read every book published in the 19th or 20th centuries, many scholars are justifiably reluctant to assume that simply including more books in our analysis will make much difference. I wasn't myself sure 5 years ago, before I started doing this, that it would. If we're reading the important books, or even a reasonably representative sample, it seems that expanding the size of the sample might not add much new. What has changed my mind is simply seeing the concrete results that have turned up in various research programs at different universities over the last 5 years. I think this project Moretti called Distant Reading is succeeding. But it's succeeding for reasons that may be different than originally advertised. Because Distant Reading was at first framed as yet another canon-expanding project, literary scholars may have felt that the point was to broaden our coverage of a single synchronic moment. We'll consider not just T.S. Eliot, but everything else published in 1917. And then many people shudder because it sounds like that means giving historical weight to a lot of frankly uninteresting books, which would make me shudder too in some moods anyway. But I don't think that has actually turned out to be the point of Distant Reading. The important discoveries that have come out of the project so far mostly don't come from broadening synchronic coverage of a single moment, but I would argue from stretching the diachronic length of the timelines we discuss. When we organize direct comparisons between hundreds or thousands of works over a period of a century or more, we tend to stumble on long arcs of change that we couldn't previously describe. Thus my title. I think we're in the process of glimpsing a new kind of literary longue durée. Of course, it's hard to compare hundreds of books directly. To do that, we usually have to measure something to render them comparable. So I'll be talking about quantitative research, which is relatively new in our discipline and understandably controversial. I trust we'll get into the controversy, but my goal is not necessarily to convince you that the scholars doing this have found the right methods yet. It's more simply to suggest that there are large patterns out there that need to be described, whether we've described and interpreted them adequately yet or not. And I want to start empirically by just pointing to some examples. I'll start with some results that come out of the literary lab at Stanford, where Moretti has been working. These are actually results developed by students of his, rather than by Moretti himself. And then move towards some things that we found ourselves at Illinois. At the same time, we'll move from the 19th century toward the 20th. So, here are two graphs from a pamphlet published by the Literary Lab in 2012. Each dot here is the frequency of a particular group of words in a particular novel, and the x-axis is time, mostly the 19th century. So we're seeing the increasing frequency of two word groups in 19th century fiction: colors and locative prepositions, prepositions that express relationships in space. Ryan Heuser and Longue, who wrote this pamphlet, were interested in finding semantically related groups of words that become much more or much less common over time in 19th century fiction. And they found that a whole set of semantic categories used in physical description become more common as we head toward the year 1900. Body parts, action verbs, simple physical adjectives like round or hard, as well as colors, numbers, and locative prepositions. In short, a lot of kinds of language used for physical description increase in frequency. They called these words hard seeds because they originally found them by noticing that the word hard became more common over time in the novel. And then they used that kind of as a net to catch a number of other words that were following the same pattern. That was the seed that they used to create the rest of this list. When you add them all together and look at the aggregate trend for all these groups of words, it's quite a dramatic increase. Words in these categories go from being 3% of the words used in novels around 1800 to 6% around 1900. The amount of space spent on this sort of physical description doubles. At the same time, as they also show, language that describes sentiment or moral judgment is declining in frequency. Is this a general shift from abstract to concrete language? Well, it's tricky to say that for a lot of reasons. Words have multiple senses, as we all know. The word hard itself can mean difficult, which is not exactly a physical description. And as literary critics, of course, we love detail. We love to find exceptions to a rule. But honestly, slight changes to this list won't change the big picture here. The more important reason why we can't say this is an increase in physical description in general is that there are many different kinds of physical description. For instance, Heuser and Lecoq could have included more nouns in this list, trees, buildings, what have you. No single list of words could represent all kinds of physical description. The pamphlet can only claim to be showing that there is one particular kind of concrete description, emphasizing, for instance, colors, human bodies, movements in space, that increases across the 19th century. But with all those caveats, it remains true that there's a real trend here. Doubling the space allocated to a particular kind of description in the novel is still a significant change. So, is this a glimpse of a pattern that's important that we should pay attention to? There's another way to resist that conclusion. There's another way to push aside this result and say, perhaps this is no big deal. We could say, well, okay, this is a trend, but isn't it basically something we already knew? A very common response to this kind of result. And it raises an interesting theoretical problem. What would it mean to say that we already knew something like this? For instance, suppose I said, this is nothing new. The increasing space allocated to physical detail is just the rise of realism and naturalism, which all scholars of the novel already knew. Am I right? Well, I'm probably right that there is some connection between realism and concrete detail. As Heuser and Lecoq themselves say, we could be looking at the rise of that principle to show rather than tell in fiction. So this evidence may be related to something we knew. That's to say, we don't necessarily find it counterintuitive. And in our discipline, literary study, we are used to demanding that results be counterintuitive. For instance, it really wouldn't be interesting to do a close reading of a single novel somewhere in the 1890s and show that it does a lot of concrete description. Even though that might be technically new information, it wouldn't be surprising enough to matter in our discipline. Readings of a single text only become interesting if they actually overturn something we previously believed. What we're seeing here is novelty of a different kind. There's no way for the Stanford pamphlet to overturn received opinions because it's answering a question we simply hadn't posed on this scale. But it's still telling us something we really did not know. We didn't know that there was a trend of this sort in 19th century fiction at all. We certainly didn't know that it was a trend of this magnitude or a steady trend. Our stories about literary history, even about something as large as realism, tend to imply a more volatile and sharply periodized sort of history. In some histories of American literature, realism doesn't begin until after the Civil War. In some accounts, it's distinct from naturalism. Very few histories say realism should be understood as a phenomenon that grew steadily at a constant pace through the 19th century. And actually, we still don't know how far our concept of realism really explains this stylistic phenomenon. In the Stanford collection, two of the books that had most concrete description in them were Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and H.G. Wells' Time Machine. Neither is normally considered a realist masterpiece. So I think this is not simply the rise of realism, or of anything else we already knew. Another way to demonstrate that is to try extrapolating the pattern forward or backward. If this trend is something we already knew, presumably we also know what's going to happen when it hits modernism. Will this trend reverse and turn back down at 1910 as abstraction and psychology become more important? Or we could try extrapolating to other genres. Do we imagine that physical description was also on the rise, for instance, in poetry or in prose nonfiction? Do we already know those things? It's good to sort of test in advance before you reveal this sort of thing, because otherwise it's very easy conclude in retrospect that we probably could have known that. Well, the Stanford pamphlet came out in 2012, and we've had some time to get a bigger picture since then. This is the evidence we have available now at Illinois, using the same list of words Heuser and Lecoq were using, but a data set that is broader in terms of time and genre, and also nationality. American and British books are mixed together here. And briefly, I'm not sure how clear it is from the back of the room, but this purple line at the top, those are poetry. The green line, there are actually two different collections we're using, but they're both green and are both fiction in the middle. And the bottom line is black because it's boring and it's prose nonfiction. And to simplify things visually in this graph, we're now plotting 1 dot per year instead of 1 dot per book. We average all the books, add up all the books in a single year. You can see that, in a sense, the story in the 19th century is that poetry and fiction both differentiate themselves along this axis, in this particular sort of physical description, from non-fiction prose. You can also see that the rising importance of this sort of description is not stopped by modernism. The trajectory doesn't flatten out until 1950, at which point the Stanford hard seed words are occupying almost 9% of the space in your average novel, triple what they had occupied in 1800. As I say, I don't think this is necessarily counterintuitive, but I also don't think it's something we already knew. We've studied poetry and fiction for a long time, but it is still possible for us to have missed things, even big things, about the history of literature simply because we had not backed up far enough to see them. I say we had to back up to see this pattern because I believe the key methodological innovation here is direct comparison between a large number of works over a long span of time. This discovery actually didn't depend on expanding the canon as such. This is actually a different, more canonical selection of works than they were using at Stanford, but we see broadly the same trend. If you plot only canonical works, the diachronic trend, the change over time, still largely the same. It would become a little different here after 1950. Self-consciously literary fiction after 1950 does use less physical description. But on the whole, the trends are the same. This hasn't depended on expanding the canon, but on tracing any sample of the literary field over a sufficient length of time. And the reason we haven't been able to describe these patterns persuasively without numbers is, I think, simply that it's hard for a single human memory to make meaningful comparisons across timelines this long. Comparisons across 500 or thousands of volumes, in practice, we don't really try to do that ourselves individually. When we write macroscopic literary histories, we rely in practice on summaries by other scholars and connect them to our own reading, which means we end up relying necessarily, in great part, on received ideas about history. I think that's one of the reasons why our system of periodization, for instance, remains so stable. Periods are the framework of collective understanding we currently use to organize the literary Longue Durée, and they're very powerful. As I tried to show in the recent book, there were lots of arguments against periodization in early 20th century universities. And they often succeeded intellectually in persuading other scholars, but they never succeeded in changing our collective practice. Since periodization is the collective framework we use to write large-scale narrative, arguing against it is like trying to move the rock you're standing on. It's a kind of futile task. One of the advantages of quantitative methods is that they may allow us to break free and give us a glimpse of a literary history that could be organized by continuous trends rather than fateful dates, turns, and discrete movements. But how would that really work? How could we ever interpret a continuous trend or make it meaningful? That, I think, is the real challenge that confronts distant readers. And to address it, we're going to need different methods. What I've shown you so far are descriptive statistics. We measure something and graph it over time. This tells us only that a change happened. It doesn't really tell us how the change ought to be described. For instance, I've been describing this trend in the way that researchers at Stanford originally described it, a shift in the balance between abstract and concrete description in fiction. But at the same time they were doing that work, we at Illinois were pursuing a parallel project that divided language in a different way. In English, as you may know, much of our learned vocabulary is drawn from French, because for 200 years, French was the written language of that island. So the contrast between words that come from Old English and those that come from French or Latin is often also a social contrast. The older Germanic part of the English lexicon is used heavily in informal contexts and in speech. The part drawn from French can seem more learned or literate. So while the Stanford team was studying the history of concrete description, we were studying preferences for Germanic or Latin vocabulary and tracing those over time. And it turns out that these are loosely the same trends in fiction. The learned words we borrowed from French and Latin are often abstract, and the Old English part of the lexicon is often relatively concrete. So if you plot the ratio of Germanic to Latin fiction in the novel, and actually in poetry and nonfiction prose again, because we had a collection across genres, you see a trend that's loosely similar to the one the Stanford researchers saw. Simpler, more concrete words become important in the literary genres in the 19th century, so the ratio of Germanic vocabulary, or technically I'm taking all words that entered the language before 1150 to words that entered between 1150 and 1700 when the graph begins. That ratio rises in the literary genres and actually drops a bit in nonfiction. So again, there's a differentiation of genres that you see. But because we're approaching the problem from a different angle, we're giving it a slightly different interpretation than the Stanford researchers gave it. To us, this looked less like a problem bound up with the rise of realism in fiction, and more like a broader transformation of literary language that separated both poetry and fiction from nonfiction, perhaps by establishing a new kind of literary distinction that reversed the older preference for an overtly learned style. We're drawing implicitly here on Bourdieusian ideas about the literary field. Literary sophistication starts to be produced paradoxically by relying on simpler, more concrete language. That's a nice story, but the Stanford researchers also had a nice story. They linked it back ultimately to urbanization. How could we ever decide between these different interpretations of roughly the same trend? I think merely counting words and graphing their frequencies won't do it. That kind of description is too weak. It's compatible with too many different kinds of interpretations. How do we move beyond merely measuring change? There are two ways, one of which I think literary critics will welcome, and one they will probably hate, at least initially. The one they'll welcome is to use close reading, or a particularized social context to interpret individual case studies. Obviously that's going to be popular. It's the method that already dominates our discipline. We know how to do it, and I think it's a good method. I certainly continue to do a lot of close reading. Franco Moretti continues to do a lot of close reading, though he pretended not to successfully get everyone interested. He's a smart man. But he still does close reading, and he's still good at it. There's no danger in that being displaced. On the other hand, and it's a useful method. It illustrates things. It helps us understand what they mean concretely. But I don't think it will help us decide between competing descriptions of a Longue Durée. All the people involved at Stanford and Illinois in this debate are trained as literary scholars. We can all go out and find case studies to illustrate our interpretation. But you can find when you're talking about 1,000 books, you can find 3 case studies to prove anything, really. Especially now that we have keyword search, right? We all use it. Let me find 3 case studies that prove my thesis. Very easy to do. So, what we need to decide between interpretations is something else that literary scholars don't usually use, which is statistical inference. We need not just to plot points, but to assess the strength of a relationship between different social phenomena. To do that, we need metadata, which is something that has been scarce in distant reading until recently. We're getting more of it. We need social information about these texts, not just counting words, but information about literary production and reception. For instance, Jordan Sellers and I were arguing that this trend reflects a new kind of literary distinction, a sophistication that is revealed paradoxically through simplicity and concreteness. If that's true, then we ought to see this kind of diction appearing, particularly in celebrated writers and prestigious venues of publication. But the reverse hypothesis could, after all, be true. We also know that the reading audience expanded in the 19th century, and it seems just as plausible that concrete language might have been associated with popular writing, dime novels, penny dreadfuls appealing to a newly literate audience. Maybe that's why we see more references to body parts and action verbs and so on. To decide between those opposed theories, we need some information about reception. You could look at sales or publishers or the prices on volumes. Right now we've started by looking at reviews in order to separate volumes that had prominence and cultural prestige from the rest of the literary field. Then we can test the hypothesis that the move toward simpler or more concrete language was led by a prestigious subset of writers. So here's a list of periodicals that we gathered reviews from and then gathered books mentioned in those reviews. The main assumption we make in selecting this sort of sample is that being reviewed at all in certain venues, the Egotist or the Atlantic or a Fortnightly Review, can be a sign of prominence and prestige, even if the review is negative. After all, many books never get reviewed. We did record whether reviews were positive or negative when that was clear, but we put more emphasis on the mere appearance of a book in a certain prestigious venue. To make that strategy work, we tried to choose periodicals that were selective about what they did review, typically monthly or fortnightly publications rather than weekly. We also needed a sample from a larger pool of books that would contain works reviewed less often or in less prestigious venues. This is where digital libraries really start to help you. We worked with HathiTrust Digital Library, which contains the aggregated collections of large public and university libraries. In the period we're studying, that gave us a set of roughly 760,000 volumes. A lot of those nonfiction, but once you find the verse, there are about 53,000 volumes that have poetry. This doesn't exhaustively cover print culture, it's still a sample, but it's a sample much broader than the universe of things reviewed in elite periodicals, and what we needed in this study was contrast. Volumes sampled from this large pool tended to be either simply obscure, or things like collections of newspaper verse that had a non-elite readership. We've gathered, reviewed, and random samples for both fiction and poetry, but I'm going to focus on the poetry research now because it's more complete, and that is going to create a little confusion because we started out talking about fiction. I'm going to try to explain it with some evidence about poetry, which will be a leap, but bear with me. So for poetry, we gathered 360 reviewed and 360 random volumes across the period from 1820 to 1919. And we wanted to find out, first of all, whether there was any stylistic difference at all between these two sets. Maybe there is no coherent stylistic difference marking those different social locations. We don't know what the stylistic difference might be. It might not be related to the lists of words we were using. So how do you detect an unknown stylistic difference? One thing you can do is train a predictive model. The way that works is roughly this. We allow the computer to see books by all the authors in both samples except one author. And then the computer creates a model, basically looking at word frequencies in those books. It tries to find a way of separating them into reviewed and random samples just by looking at the word frequencies, a statistical model. Then we show the model a book by the author it hasn't yet seen, and ask it to predict which sample it came from. Was this reviewed in a prestigious venue, or did we just find it randomly in a large digital library? The point isn't literally to predict events that already happened, but to discover whether there's any generalizable relationship between poetic language and reception. We stage this as a prediction about an author the model hasn't yet seen in order to find out whether the model has just generalized a particular set of examples. It can always find some difference between a limited set of examples, or whether it has really discovered a pattern that generalizes to cases it hasn't encountered yet. So we're testing whether this is really a model that has any predictive value. The information we use to train the model is binary. Each volume either came from a random or reviewed sample, nothing in between. But the results the model gives us back don't have to be binary. When it's looking at a volume, it uses its knowledge of the other volumes to predict a probability that this volume came from the reviewed sample. So you'll see volume spread out across the y-axis as more or less likely to have come from that reviewed sample. So for instance, suppose we'll borrow a hypothesis from Andreas Huyssen and say in the 19th century there really isn't that much difference between mass culture, popular culture, and elite taste. They're not clearly differentiated yet. If that was true, the model might have difficulty separating the reviewed and random samples in the 19th century. This goes from 1820 to 1900 and up to 1919. In the 19th century, hypothetically, this is just made up data to illustrate what we might expect to see. We might have the red and gray data points more or less mixed together. We can't distinguish one as distinctly more probable to come from the reviewed sample or not. Each volume is confusing. And then hypothetically, if Huyssen is right that there's a differentiation that sets in the late 19th century, there might, as works are addressed more specifically to a particular audience, the style might specialize, it might get easier to tell them apart, even for a computer, and we might finally be able to distinguish the red or reviewed data points from the gray ones. In practice, there's one other thing. You'll notice these volumes are sort of arranged in temporal slices, in clumps. And that's because initially we thought we would probably have to train many different models. We didn't assume that the principle organizing literary prestige in 1910 would be the same as it had been in 1860. It seemed actually pretty unlikely that it would remain the same. So we expected to train different models for different 20-year periods. But in practice, we found something quite different. We didn't have to train separate models. In fact, the best solution we could come up with was just a single model using all of the data. And we also, which is this, same time span, and this is the actual 720 books we're looking at. In each case, the model is making a blind prediction about the books from one author, not having seen that author. The other thing that surprised us is we really don't see that confusion going back into the 19th century that we expected to see. We thought elite poetic taste would only be distinguished from these random books toward the end of the century. But in fact, the model was pretty good at distinguishing them all along the line. It might get a little bit less so before 1840. In that period, its accuracy drops off. But how do we even evaluate a model like this? How would we measure accuracy? You can't really see the white line across the middle at 50%. But in principle, the model is saying everything above that line is more likely than not to have come from a reviewed sample. So if we use that line to evaluate its accuracy and say, how often is it right about the things above that line, it's 77% accurate. Not perfect, but kind of surprising given how many things can affect reception. You wouldn't necessarily expect it to be driven solely by language. The slanted black line here is just the central trend line for the whole group. If we just divide the whole thing in half. And it's going up over time because, as you'll notice, all the points kind of drift up over time, which is an interesting fact that I probably won't fully explain in this talk, but we could talk about what that implies afterwards. If we use that slanted line and acknowledge that the predictions change over time, we get 79% accurate. Technically, the upward drift we're acknowledging is an error in the model. Books are not really more likely to be reviewed just because they were published later. But it's an error of an interesting kind because the upward drift suggests that the criteria of literary prestige were bound up somehow with literary change. But the more fundamental surprise here is just that we can separate the samples accurately by treating the whole century as a single unit, organized by a single set of standards. In other words, you can use the same set of prestigious or banal words to distinguish Tennyson's poems in 2 volumes from less prominent works in 1842, and to distinguish Amy Lowell from less prominent works published in the 19-teens, or T.S. Eliot's Prufrock and Other Observations, which is up there in 1917. If a single linguistic model can predict literary prestige across that stylistic difference, some aspect of reception must be more stable than we anticipated. Reviewers may have disagreed about politics and about the merits of particular books, but they seem to have shared a loose, durable consensus, at least about the outer boundary of literary distinction. The question, what kind of writing is even worthy of notice? So what was that consensus? I'm going to do something I shouldn't do and rush through the close reading. I'll give you at least the first close reading of it. I'll say simply that one way to understand what the model is doing is to look at passages in detail. So what I've done here is taken a passage from Christina Rossetti that the model sees as very likely to be reviewed, and highlighted in red the words that help that passage, that lift it up on the scale and make the model conclude this is likely to be a prestigious poem. And there's one word in blue there because it has a significant negative effect in the model. It makes this passage less likely to be reviewed. I'll read the passage because we're literary scholars. It's the end of a poem called Echo. Yet come to me in dreams that I may live my very life again, though cold in death. Come back to me in dreams that I may give pulse for pulse, breath for breath. Speak low, lean low, as long ago, my love, how long ago. If you glance at this, one of the interesting things, if you think back to what we were talking about earlier, is that there's a lot of concrete language here helping this passage. Cold, back is technically a locative preposition, come back to me. So that's part of what the model likes about Christina Rossetti. But I should also acknowledge there's a lot of other stuff going on here. The model likes certain abstractions too, such as dreams and death. It likes low, but not high, bitter, but not sweet. In fact, I may as well come out and admit this model is happiest when poems are a bit desolate. Shuddering, blind, hollow, and blank are some of its favorite words. It has an allergy to kindness and valor, and doesn't even like homes. We can see why if we look at some of the books that the model correctly predicts are unlikely to be reviewed. Here's a very obscure American poem called Memorial or Decoration Day from 1891. And you see that it has some abstractions. The bit is tribute to the honored dead. It's about war dead. Those who battled for these homes of ours and precious blood on freedom's altar shed. There's some abstraction here like precious and altar, but more generally it's the positive terms, even things that might be concrete like homes. And the model has learned that this kind of sentimental invocation of community often occurs in a large group of poems about political or religious themes that just don't get very far in 19th century literary culture. So those words have a negative effect on this prediction. In short, there's a lot going on in the statistical model of literary prestige. There's some things going on about gender that I haven't mentioned yet that would be fun to discuss. The linguistic issue we began with, a contrast between physical description and abstract sentiment, is only one part of this model. There's a lot more we could explore. But that issue about concrete versus abstract description is still a part of the model. The two issues are related. And one simple way to think about a relationship between two variables is to measure a correlation. For each volume, we have the model's degree of confidence that it came from the reviewed set, and we can also measure the proportion of words in that volume that belong to the Stanford hard Cs. Those two variables tend to vary together. So that list of categories they created at Stanford, numbers, colors, body parts, action verbs, is not just a list of things that increase over time in the 19th century novel, which is how they found those words. It's also a list of things that tend to distinguish prestigiously reviewed poems from poems that languish in obscurity or in mere popularity. I realize it's strange that we're comparing two different genres here. We are seeing, by the way, similar evidence in fiction, but the story in fiction is not quite as clear. The correlation is less strong. This graph may also be confusing because the model's predictions are not real things. They're just abstract degrees of confidence expressed by a statistical model. To make things a little more concrete, what we could do is graph the percentage of hard seed words in all these poetry volumes as the y-axis and date as the x-axis, and separate the reviewed and random samples with different colors. And here you can see that the reviewed sample is consistently distinguished by having more of that concrete language. The top trend line there is you can barely see it because it's pale, but is the average trend for the reviewed volumes. The bottom one is the average trend for the random volumes, and they're statistically significantly separated all the way across time. The reviewed volumes are leading the trend toward having more of that concrete kind of description. So On the one hand, this gives me confidence that we at Illinois were right that this change, whatever it is associated with a new form of literary prestige. Prestigious authors are leading the trend. On the other hand, this is the list of words that they were using at Stanford, and actually, if we substitute in the etymologically derived list of words we started out using at Illinois, it doesn't work as well. It doesn't explain poetic prestige as well. So that gives me some confidence that their notion of this kind of description that increases across time up to 1950 is a coherent notion. It makes a lot of historical sense. It explains a lot of things. Not only does it explain a change that runs in fiction from 1800 to 1950, but it seems to be correlated with literary prestige in poetry, at least, from 1840 to 1919. And this starts to lead us towards some interesting hypotheses about the way synchronic literary prestige may have been related to diachronic change, which I'll leave out there for discussion. But the bigger point I want to make is a methodological one. There are still big patterns in literary history we haven't described well, let alone explained. To describe those patterns, we may need quantitative methods. Our existing historiography struggles to grasp patterns on this scale. It's like the parable of the blind man and the elephant. It has something here that feels like a snake, let's call it romanticism. To really characterize literary change over a long durée, we will need methods that can help us decide between alternate descriptions. This is not to say that anything we currently do well needs to be discarded. We do close reading well. We don't need help from computers there. Distant reading is a supplement for our current set of methods. It doesn't have to displace anything. I think people view that claim skeptically. They expect that it will have to displace something because we generally don't realize how many new kinds of patterns are still out there for us to describe. There's still a lot of room for expansion in our discipline. Thank you.